Hello, and welcome back to the Scale Ups and Hypergrowth podcast with me, Marcus Kauke. Today, I'm delighted to have as my guest, Greg Skloot, who is one of the co-founders of Crystal. Greg, would you mind giving 30 seconds on your background and how you got to where you are before we go into the gory details of your tech scale-up journey?
Absolutely. Well, Marcus, thank you so much for having me. All right, let's see. I'm going to try to compact a lot into 30 seconds. I've always been super passionate about entrepreneurship. I think I started my first business when I was 14 years old, fixing computers and building websites. And I kind of used those tech skills throughout my career. After college, we built an event management software company. 22 years old, raised a bunch of money, fell flat on our faces. Plenty of gory details there. And actually, in the wreckage of that, we found the idea for Crystal and ended up building out Crystal the way it is today. So I have kind of oscillated between the tech side and the sales side. Now I'm more on the management side, but I describe myself as just good enough to be dangerous in pretty much every aspect of the business. So I'm kind of a utility player that roams around where I'm needed.
I asked the indelicate question, how old you are?
How old do you think I am? I think that's the big
you're
question.
About 33, something like that.
And I haven't shaved in a while too. I'm 29.
29. Okay. Well, I was erring on the older side because that was a lot to pack in a very short career. So in 7 years, you've done 2 of your own tech scale-ups and you've been involved in 2 that you weren't the founder.
That's right.
So there must be a shitload of scar tissue. So let's talk about the failures first. What were your best mistakes?
Boy, where do I even begin? Well, I think when I first got out of school, and it's funny, when I talk to kids coming out of school right now looking for advice and thinking about their careers, I always say optimize for learning. Don't worry about the paycheck. Try to learn as much as you can. Go to the place that will give you way more responsibility than you probably deserve, so you actually get to learn as you go. So in the first startup after school, it was a startup marketing agency. We probably had about $60,000 in our bank account, which I thought was like unbelievable. We might as well have been millionaires.
That's like hitting the King Solomon's mines at that.
That's right. It was an amazing amount of money to me. And I got to come in and be the chief operating officer, and it was a small team, but I got to kind of play touch all the aspects of the business. I had to fire someone for the first time. I had to figure out how to run payroll, how sales worked. And of course, now looking back, oh my goodness. We had one customer that was hands down like 65% of our revenue or something like that. So God forbid anything happens to them. What a mistake. So many lessons learned that you look back now that almost was like ignorance was bliss. We so didn't know what we were doing. So we just had a blast, not realizing all the mistakes we were making. And now looking back, it's like, oof.
So what did that teach you about the value of failure?
In general, I think that some of the biggest learnings, and as you called it, the scar tissue, happened from failure. That company didn't end up working out. And right after that, I ended up starting a new one, a 10.com, which was the first one I was the co-founder of and that we raised venture capital money for. And, in that one, I think that really comes into play in some of the topics you like to talk about in this podcast. We built it up really quickly. We raised money really early. We scaled up. And ultimately, it did not work out super well for the co-founders. Drew and I talked about this in our book, but we were technically fired from that company by our investors about 2 years in. Needless to say, quite some scar tissue. And wow, just the lessons learned from that failure. It's like you can learn by reading, you can learn by practicing, but I feel like the biggest learnings come from those deep failures that kind of stick in your mind, that you can replay the scene in your mind years later. That's when you really learn from failure.
We teach about reach back and afterburn, where you reach back into your history and you drag the misery and emotion into the present all over again. You can relive it.
Is that our plan for this podcast?
No, but I'm sensing that those lessons have been burnt deep into your psyche. If you look back at that time, what would you do differently if you had your time again?
Oh my gosh. Right afterwards, we made a giant Google Doc with a huge list of all the things we would do differently for the time again. And to be fair, we've gotten to implement a lot of them in Crystal. I think a couple big ones. One is, you don't always have to be rushing to go insanely fast before the product is ready. With Attend.com, we raised money really early, and then there was a lot of pressure, in some ways rightfully so from an investor's perspective, to build out a sales team. But our product just wasn't ready. It was buggy. It really didn't have product market fit. And so we were pouring gas into a very, very inefficient machine. And that ultimately caused us, lots of pain later. So, with Crystal, we have been a lot more methodical. We've grown slowly, but in a much more profitable way. And we've gotten to the point where our product is just in a much better place, a lot more stable. And now we can scale up in sales and marketing at the right natural pace, rather than trying to fake it too early and then paying for it later.
Very interesting. So the lesson there is slow down to speed up.
Yes. In the long run, yes. Great way to say it.
How do you do that when your private equity or venture capital is screaming, hurry, hurry, hurry? First of all, how do you keep them under control? And secondly, how do you make sure that you pick the right kind of money? When I interviewed Drew, he came up with a lovely definition. So you have good money, bad money, and dumb money. And his preference was to go for the dumb money, because bad money is often disguised as good money. How do you make sure that you go for the right kind of money and that you negotiate with them what is acceptable and not acceptable in terms of the pace at which you grow?
Yeah. So I think that timing is super important. So in general, regardless of whether it's good, bad, or dumb, bringing it in at the right or the wrong time, I just think is so critical. If you bring it in too early, when you're just not ready to do that scaling, then you have problems that you shouldn't be dealing with. So figuring out how to go a little bit slower, maybe that means you can't build up a giant sales team on day one, but you have more time to get the product right before rushing. I think in our case with Attend.com, and to be fair, look, we were a bunch of 22-year-old kids. We raised $1 million, in the first time. I remember I was coming off of a role that I thought $60,000 was, as you said, the main treasure chest. So this was like, I'm Bill Gates now.
What toys did you buy that you shouldn't have?
You know what? It's funny, actually. I can tell you exactly the first purchase that I made with that money. It was about 50 Starbucks gift cards to send to prospective clients, right, and a banana. That is what I purchased. That was my first purchase from a Starbucks in Boston with that money. I will never forget it. Thinking a lot about the timing, making sure that you're not bringing in money too early. I think another really important one is finding, we talk about product market fit so much with our products. I think we need to be talking about investor company fit a lot more, because even within those, buckets that Drew described, there are so many different investors that have different core competencies. And just as me as an entrepreneur, now I have a decent amount of experience in software. I'm not quite sure I'm qualified to go run an oil company. I probably wouldn't get thrown into that role. But software I know decently well. And it should be really similar with investors. Just because someone has money doesn't necessarily mean they're qualified to invest in your business. So really taking a deeper look and saying, what companies that look like me has this investor invested in? What founders that look like me, with regards to stage, age, experience, company type, company product, sales model, have these investors invested in? If you get that mismatch wrong, then often the investors will try to almost pattern match what they think makes sense for your business based on what they've seen in other businesses, but they don't quite have the data to realize it doesn't work for your business. And that can create lots of frustration across the board.
Very interesting. And in terms of the timing, what I often see in tech scale-ups is that they go to private equity or venture funding for oxygen rather than fuel or food. And I think one of the big mistakes is going to investors to keep the business alive rather than to give it an impetus. Another thing that I've seen with many of the really successful tech scale-ups, so the likes of Thycotic, UiPath, Splunk, is they've used the same investors repeatedly, time and time again, same management team, time and time again. And the money is used for seed capital to create the next jump. It's not to keep the business alive. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's very true. And we ran into some of those challenges in my last company. This was when I wasn't the founder of NetPulse, where we'd scaled up a pretty big team, and the company was going through a pretty major pivot. We were pivoting from it's kind of a weird story, but it was a company that had been around for a while, building a different product, and we were pivoting that legacy product into this new SaaS product. And one of the challenges we ran into was the cost structure was still left over from the legacy company. It was almost acting a little bit like dead weight that we were carrying, and so our expenses were much, much higher. Now looking back, like, oh my goodness, that burn rate just made no sense. It made it so difficult to operate. And as a result, we had to raise more money to sustain that rather than necessarily pour fuel on the fire. Coming back to mistakes, looking back at that one, wow, I think we should have reduced our costs a lot earlier. And unfortunately, there were a couple times in that one where we had to do layoffs, and that is just not fun for anybody. I know with Crystal now, maybe fourth time's the charm, we have been much more conservative on hiring. We do not hire fast. We actually just made 2 offers that got accepted a couple days ago, which is really exciting. We hadn't hired anybody in months prior. We worked with who we had, and we scaled up their roles. And it feels like in Silicon Valley, that is more the exception rather than the rule. I think the default is, build, scale up like crazy, hire as many people as you possibly can. And I guess that works as long as the music is playing. But if the music ever stops, it becomes very unpleasant. No one wants to have to dismantle a team they built.
Did you have a clear idea of the roles that you were going to need, say, 6 or 12 months ago, and an idea of what would trigger those hires? So you'd already set budget aside, you knew what the trigger points were, or did something happen that you said, right, now is the right time?
It's a combination of both. And I think in an early stage company, like everybody's different. I know for ours, it changes on a dime. I mean, every month we get new data, new things happen. We get new ideas, new feedback from customers, and it feels like the strategy evolves. So trying to, at least at our size, was a bit smaller, trying to speculate what's going to happen a year from now is just so hard. So in our case, we had a broad idea and a broad milestone we were trying to get to that would trigger scaling up, in this case, in sales and marketing. And we did hit that trigger. We probably figured it out maybe a quarter before, and then we hit the trigger actually right in the midst of the pandemic, which is, I guess, a positive. And so that triggered us. I think at the same time, we saw some opportunity with the way the job market is. There's a lot of really talented people suddenly on the market. So it's a decent time to be hiring. So that certainly came into play too.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. I mean, I think this represents a fabulous opportunity for organizations to look at their sales operation and take a blank sheet of paper and say, right, if I was going to start from scratch and I was going to design the sales organization that we really want and need, what would it look like? Because I think a lot of sales organizations have kind of morphed into what they are. And COVID represents a fabulous opportunity if you're brave enough to take it, to take advantage of the talent that's going to be out there. And in the next 60 to 90 days, my expectation is that there will be a glut of really talented salespeople on the market, because organizations that made it through aren't going to be able to survive afterwards. Because I think a lot of companies make it through. This is my 4th, maybe 5th recession. And a lot of companies make it through, but then they can't make it past that when they have to recover. And I think there's going to be a lot of talent on the market.
Yeah, I would tend to agree.
Okay, so tell me this. What are the 4 most common questions you get asked by budding founders who are looking to scale up their business in terms of the things to do right when you're building a tech scale up?
Yeah, so certainly recruiting is typically towards the top of everybody's stress list, and I certainly see it. In some ways, it's funny because I had mentioned we hadn't done any hiring in a little while. I forgot what a pain in the butt it is. So the last month has been like, oh my gosh, all these interviews, so much work. And this is like, most of these are going in the trash, right? It's not, you're only going to hire one person, but you might interview 20. So it just managing that workload and figuring out, how do you hire a VP or executive level person? I mean, talk about mistakes I've made in the past or that I've watched been made. I mean, that is really tough to get right. Really tough to get right. So certainly learned a ton about how to do those interviews better and ask the right questions and try to do the matching. And I think that's a question I often hear is how do I identify what I need for a head of sales or a head of marketing, and how do I find them? So that's certainly a big one. A lot, interestingly, recently, I think a lot of other founders have been talking about remote, which I think is relevant just to the current times. How are people thinking about keeping their office, becoming a remote company? Should we hire people that are in different locations? That was much more of a fringe thing, or not something that really came up a lot. Now it seems like every conversation I'm having, both me and others are, exchanging opinions on, are we going remote? Are we getting rid of our office? What do we do? And how's this going to work? So that's certainly one that comes up too. Certainly technical questions. In my last company, I kind of leaned pretty heavily into the marketing side of things. So, often building a marketing organization from the ground up can be scary. I think a lot of founders who are more tech oriented, which to be fair is very hard, like in their minds, that's easy. But then the sales and marketing stuff, they're like, oh my gosh, well, I built a product. Here it is. What do I do now? And maybe that's a little bit earlier. That's not as much in the scale up stage. Anyway, I might be starting to rambling, but I'd say those seems to be the topics that tend to come up when I'm talking to other founders.
It's really interesting. I see this a lot, and there is an antidote to drowning under the flood of resumes and CVs and those interviews, which is make interviewing the manager's equivalent of a salesperson prospecting for new clients. Make interviewing a daily activity. And as the old Chinese proverb says, when is the best time to plant a tree 20 years ago? If you build a bench of candidates and you say to them, Greg, I haven't got a job at the moment. However, I am going to be recruiting over the next 6 to 12 months. So I'm looking for my candidates now. If I can offer you this kind of package and for this kind of role, is there any reason why you wouldn't give it serious consideration? And building up that candidate bench so that you've got 5 candidates lined up. And that way you never have to recruit in a hurry. Because I think one of the biggest mistakes I see in companies, especially as they scale, is they start to compromise on recruitment, and you never compromise on recruitment. The single highest hidden cost in any business is wrong hires, particularly in sales management, and the channel. If you make a wrong sales hire, a pal of mine, Phil McGowan, is an academic here in the UK, and he's just done his PhD thesis on this. And it takes 38 months to recover when you make a bad hire and they leave.
Wow. It makes sense. And it's funny. I'm sure you've seen this too. I mean, the temptation as you're deep into a recruiting cycle and you have someone that's pretty good, but you have that gut feeling that there's something a little off, like this isn't quite the right fit, but it's really close. They have most of what I need, and I just want to be done with this. I have definitely fell victim to that before, and I always have generally regretted it. But it's such a easy pit to fall into as a hiring manager or as an entrepreneur, because you want to get the person in so you can get back to work. But being picky on hiring is just, you have to.
That then brings me to the next thing, which is design the ideal candidate. So instead of a job description, have a hiring template and look at what the predictors of success are and be clear about what the must-haves are, the nice-to-haves, and the red flags. And if anyone raises a red flag, investigate further, and any evidence that's present, instant disqualification. Anyone who has all of the must-haves, none of the red flags, they're a viable candidate. And you use nice-to-haves to differentiate between 2 candidates who have all the must-haves and none of the red flags. However, if you have 8 must-have characteristics and they only have 7, it's a no hire. Take your time. Better no breath than bad breath in a sales role.
That is very good advice. And I think, frankly, it probably transcends beyond sales.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's great advice.
Whatever position, because wrong hires in any position create management problems down the road. And when you're growing, the business that you started out on January the 1st is going to be a very different by March the 20th and by July the 15th and by September the 18th and by December the 21st. They're completely different businesses. So they need to be people who are adaptable and welcome change. So if they grumble and say, oh, are we changing that again? You've probably made a bad hire.
And this actually brings us full circle back to an important point you made, where this is maybe a time where people should be looking at their sales organizations and thinking, what would it look like if I started from scratch? Well, I mean, to be fair, that's hard. And many people, rightfully so, it's hard to muster up the guts to do that. We talk about how difficult it is to make a good hire. A lot of entrepreneurs I talk to, and maybe I can add this as my fourth one, so I didn't get to 4 questions to answer your question fully. How do I gracefully get someone out of the organization without making a giant mess? Honestly, I would probably elevate that as I think about talking to other founders and executives and some of the challenges they run into. Regardless of industry, of company size, universally, it seems like one of the most highest stress points is I have someone in my organization that is not working. I don't seem to have the guts to fire them, but they're here and they're causing me all this stress. And that, if you think about it, is probably even harder than going through the process of making a really good hire, is actually getting the person out and dealing with any fallout and making sure the company still runs smoothly, and of course replacing them. Perhaps that's the 38 months of trauma that you were mentioning.
Well, there are 2 fabulous books that every entrepreneur should get hold of. The first one is called Accountability by Hamish Knox. And the second one is The Sales Coach's Playbook by Bill Bartlett. A sales manager only has 4 functions in my book. Every job description for a sales manager reads like this: hire the best people. So you never compromise on recruitment. Second thing, get the best out of them. That means a good pre-onboarding, onboarding, training, and coaching and accountability process. Net result of that is what you end up with is really good people, and you're helping them perform at their best and meeting their potential. That means that you have to have challenging conversations with them. It means that if they're not performing, you have to work out why not. And your job is to make them better. Your job is to make your salespeople wildly successful. Your job is not to hit your target. Your job is to help the team hit the team target. The third thing is make sure they have the tools and resources they need every day to do their best work. That means the right CRM built correctly, the right sales enablement technologies. So things like Gong, Refract, Chorus, making sure that they have an enterprise sales methodology, a sales methodology, a channel methodology, whatever it happens to be, and implement that with ruthless efficiency. And then the fourth thing is help them clear the roadblocks. So what's really important, and again, particularly as we start to increasingly what we're finding is more and more millennials are moving into management roles. But the people that they've been trained by have not trained them how to prospect. They haven't trained them how to coach. And so having a Monday morning check-in where we focus on the top 3 goals for the week, not make 3 appointments per day, but make it something important, like learn how to have a conversation with the CFO about what their strategic objectives are, or improve this, that, and the other. And Warren Buffett paraphrased Samuel Johnson, where he said, the chains of habit are too light to be felt until they're too heavy to break. So start light and help them build the right habits. And when they've given you those goals, identify why they picked them, how they'll measure it, what are the consequences of them not achieving those goals, and how can you help them to achieve those goals. These aren't gotcha exercises. And then bookend the other end of the week with a Friday afternoon checkout. How did they perform against the goal? What are the specific hits and misses? What are the drivers of those hits and misses? What should they start, continue, stop, do more of, less of? And how can you help? And the idea there is that the manager is helping the salesperson get better. And in sales, you are competing with who you were yesterday. Getting half or 1% better than you were yesterday, today, and again, another half or 1% tomorrow, means that over the course of a year, you're 300% better in a year. If you do 1%, that's 1,400% better. That's what the manager's job is. And the problem is that very few people, I think the most underserviced, undertrained, and most precarious people in any organization are middle sales management. And those are the people who really need the support and help from founders and leaders. So your thoughts on that as you're growing your business? What are your thoughts in terms of how you build a really strong middle management layer?
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, I think for smaller organizations, there's probably less of a middle management, and it's just its main sales management on day one is performing all the functions you just described, and then as the organization evolves, there's maybe someone managing SDRs or someone managing AEs. It probably comes back to, I mean, in our case, we're actually recruiting a head of sales. So, gosh, talk about an important hire and a high penalty for getting it wrong at the VP level. So thinking about all of the points we talked about earlier on, what happens if we make a bad hire? How long will they take to undo it if it's wrong? If you have the wrong person in that top seat, then hypothetically all the people they recruit might be wrong. And then, oh my gosh, the ability to, how difficult it gets to unwind that. So I think that an important point that you bring up is just the operational and almost processizing of sales management, where you have the kind of operational rigor to have a process where we're doing that Monday morning check-in, the Friday morning checkout. Everything is logged properly in the CRM. The infrastructure is there in place. That is definitely something as we think about like CRM infrastructure. It's an area that almost, it seems unsexy. And I know we were talking a little bit about sales enablement before and perhaps where their role is in setting up CRM infrastructure. But when I'm thinking about hiring a head of sales on day one for an early stage company, gosh, they better be able to make that CRM function right. I think a mistake I have made in the past or have seen made at other companies is when you bring on a early sales leader that is really experienced, really strategic, but doesn't know how to use the CRM. And then you run into this trouble. Gosh, like, do we need to now, are we hiring a CRM administrator in addition? Because we're really planning to afford that. So making sure that certainly at the early stage that leadership level can do everything you described on the coaching side, and also can be technical enough to put the infrastructure in place to make the team function well. Certainly found it important at the earlier stage of a startup. I think as the organization grows, certainly those responsibilities can get delegated. We need a really great sales ops or marketing ops person to make the infrastructure work. And then, that original person we hired really needs to be doing some of the coaching that you just described for those middle managers. We talked a lot about how those middle sales managers might be doing that level of detailed coaching, and whether it's listening in on calls and giving direct feedback, doing a Friday afternoon check-in. We also have to think about who's coaching those middle managers. I think coming back to scar tissue and problems, I've seen often, a company that's scaling up too quickly, as you said, it could scale up too quickly and then explode. Sometimes a very common problem is people get promoted way too early. And suddenly this person was a great SDR. Now all of a sudden she's running the SDR team. She doesn't know anything about management, and she's probably struggling. Her direct reports are struggling. That is a pretty common situation, I think, in a lot of high growth companies. So planning around that is important.
You've touched on something really critical here, Greg, which is this. I interviewed Tom Castley from Outreach, and he said that they will not promote an SDR into a management role unless they've got 15 months of scar tissue under their belt. And they give them a minimum of a 6-month runway to learn how to be managers beforehand, typically at least 12 months. So they learn how to run a sales meeting. They learn how to coach because they take a new hire under their wing very early. They're coaching, they're training, they're mentoring, they're running sales meetings, they're doing the forecast, they're getting involved in interviews for new hires. And they need 15 months minimum. And the other thing he said, which I thought was really insightful, is that they don't hire the top performer. They hire the ones who have the deepest account penetration, because the ones who penetrate deep and wide within an account pay attention. They're good listeners. They're strategic. And that's what they need for their managers. And they have a really high success rate when they follow that model. Anything, typically in the past, SDRs who were promoted after only 9 months, over an 80% failure rate when they move into management. So that's really key. And the other piece, which is really important, is teach managers how to coach. Coaching is a really tough skill because it's not telling. Most managers, when they coach, what they actually do is bad training, where they tell people what to do. Coaching is about asking them to work out the problem for themselves and maybe filling in the last 20% they can't do on their own. But it's having them come up with the solution. And that's really key. And you've hit the nail on the head. When I spoke to Tom Castley, Tom Shodorf from Splunk, Jim Legg from Thycotic, all of these guys were spending a minimum of 50% up to 70% of their time coaching their direct reports, their middle management layers. And they spend a huge amount of time out in the field. They're also talking to customers, because what doesn't work very well are player managers, sales managers who also carry a personal quota, because under pressure, what they'll do is they'll focus on hitting their quota and they'll let the management side of things drop off. And that never works out well. So tell me this, what are the 3 or 4 most unasked questions that people should ask you about growing a successful tech scale up, but they don't?
Oh, I like that one. So it's interesting. I want to weave this in with a point you made earlier too around management, because I think it goes far beyond sales. When we look at companies that are scaling fast and then, how did you describe it? Wheels come off the train?
They achieving hypergrowth and then the wheels come off.
Right.
So they crash and burn.
Right. I would argue a major cause of that is often poor management. It's often we're scaling up really fast and just not everybody knows what they're doing. And so the processes and like the just company isn't necessarily well run. As I go now, as this is now number 4, I've gotten to see like well run versus not well run versus me doing it, which is in the beginning probably not that well run. And now after all the scar tissue, I say, okay, I have a decent idea now of how to run the organization. But thinking about, so coming back now to your question, what role should each person be playing and what jobs should each person not be doing? So for example, with Drew, my business partner, and I, there was a point, and we wrote about this in our book, where we went through all of the jobs he was doing. And there was like 25 of them, all these different responsibilities. He was doing customer support. He was doing accounting. He was talking to our investors. At one point, he was writing code. And we whittled it down and said, okay, like 22 of these, you should be completely fired from. And there are these 3 that you should actually be doing. Because like those are your specialties. Those are the things where your kind of personality, you get energy from and could do really well. And these other ones you're kind of just getting by with. And so when we did that and we put the right people in the right spots and took people out of and asked the question, what should you not be doing? That made the company run a lot more efficiently. I would say now, certainly Crystal is, without being, obviously I'm a little biased here, I think it's a really well-run company now. And I've gotten to now how to see a bunch of data points to see the difference between a well-run company and a not well-run company. Well-run in the sense of good cash management, good transparency, good people understanding what their roles and goals are. I've stepped into organizations where people couldn't tell me who their boss was. Could you imagine? In a startup, they don't know who their manager is. That's crazy. So those the kinds of questions of, what should people not be doing? How can I get people into the right seats? That question I feel like happens more under the surface because the symptom is we're not selling anything or we keep dropping the ball with customers. The answer is, well, that's because, so-and-so is doing 5 different jobs and he's only good at 3 of them. So, and I think that problem persists in both small companies and even if we're hyper scaling up, that happens a lot because there's a lot more business. We suddenly are just piling it on to everybody. Now, to be sure, I am always a big fan of giving everybody lots of responsibility, piling up plates very high, but they should be with tasks and responsibilities that align with that person's personality, that energize them rather than drain them. So that's certainly a big one.
I think you've touched on a couple of things here which are really important as well. There's a fabulous book by Marcus Buckingham, which was based on 29 years worth of research by the Gallup organization. And it's called The One Thing You Need to Know. And the spin-off of that is the StrengthsFinder profile, which you're probably familiar with. And the basic premise there is find people whose strengths make your weaknesses irrelevant and focus on your strengths. I did StrengthsFinder 9 years ago, and I restructured all of my work around my top 5 strength themes. And there has not been a day in the last 9 years where I have not been doing 95 to 100% of the time the stuff I'm good at, I get great feedback on, and I love to do. So time flies. When it's over, I cannot wait for it to start again. And Monday morning, I'm normally up somewhere between 3:30 and 4 o'clock because I'm so excited that the week is about to begin. and the week flies by. My biggest complaint is each week, shit, how come it's Saturday again?
I love that.
Real. Now,
Yeah.
the other thing I think that you touched on, which is really important as well, is keep things simple. Make sure that you are cash positive. And the other thing that we didn't touch on, but I think is really important, is debt free. And this brings me back to the private equity bug that I have, which is because private equity now has to pay so much more to invest and acquire companies, that they end up putting companies into debt. And it's really important that you stay out of debt. So if you're being encouraged to go into debt, particularly now, because my suspicion is that we will go through some hyperinflation and interest rates, while they're at 0% at the moment, will go through the roof and you will not be able to service that debt. Make sure you're not getting into it, or if you are, get out of it as quickly as you can. Thoughts?
Boy, I could not agree more, both for public and private companies. It's such an interesting thing right now. It just comes back to like hedge your bet, especially at a startup, or even a company that's scaling up. You don't really know what's going to happen next. You can project, but who would have seen COVID coming, for example? So in our case, COVID, we had a dip in sales. We had an increase in cancellations. It leveled out after a few weeks. But there was never a question of, oh my gosh, this is it. Like, we could go out of business. And unfortunately, there are a lot of companies that couldn't say that. A few weeks of missed cash means the end. And of course, there are different types of company structures where that sometimes it is a necessity. But I mean, it's certainly a lot harder to go bankrupt when you don't have debt. So when you have debt, it becomes a lot easier to go bankrupt. So it's definitely something to think about. And the thing that maybe isn't talked about as much is it's not just the financial side, but how does that pressure impact your decision-making ability?
Oh, yeah.
What decisions might you make about the product that you wouldn't have made, if you didn't have that pressure? Coming back to that same point we talked about earlier about the timing of VC money, right? When at a10.com, because we had that pressure too early of when we raised VC money, we cut corners on the product. We probably should have, hired a more experienced engineering team and taken 2 months and not built any new features and just gutted the thing and rebuilt to eliminate so much of the technical debt we built up. But of course, we couldn't do that because we had this big backlog of features because we were trying to service all these new customers that we weren't ready for. We really paid for it later. So to be fair, doing that takes some serious guts. It can mean pushing off the ability to hire people, pushing off the opportunity to get a $1 million check from investors. Those things are hard. Coming back to your original question, I think that's an important question we want to be answering is this actually the right time to be raising money? And to be fair, sometimes the answer is we want to raise money earlier when we have lots and lots of window to do it. That's reasonable. Even another one that comes up, I know I'm jumping, but these are coming back to those kind of four questions that should be asked is, I think I often more hear, who do you think we should be hiring next? What's the ideal look for this head of sales? I think an opposite question is, who should we be letting go? Who maybe is not quite the right fit, that we're carrying along dead weight, that is difficult to manage, that just maybe made sense before but doesn't make sense now? And how can we do that in a way that is respectful and preserves the relationship and is done the right way? That question, I feel like people should be asking more because it often relieves a tremendous amount of stress beneath the surface for some people's biggest challenges, which is often people in the organization.
In fact, that was precisely what they did within Splunk. There's a book called The Success Cadence by Dave Matson, Tom Schodorf, and Bart Finelli. And one of the first things they did was they got rid of 2 prima donna top performers within their sales because they were not good cultural fit. And they were not...
That takes guts. I mean, that's not easy to do.
I mean, these were 2 top performers, and that is a terrifying thing for any founder or any sales leader to do. But they did it, and immediately morale improved, and they started to scale. So yeah, massive recommendation for that book, because very often what you see are these blind spots many organizations tend to fall into. Because they've got those blind spots, they are not constantly recruiting. They don't have a strong process for hiring. They're not tying corporate goals to personal goals. They don't have a culture of sustained accountability. They create learned helplessness, so people tend to delegate up. They don't have a common organizational language and approach, particularly within sales. They're not capturing best practices, so they go from one mistake to the next without capturing those lessons. Onboarding is not a great experience. They don't know how to coach. They're not training management. They're not focused on lead generation. There are no methodologies and systems outside of the technical team in particular. They're not effectively planning for change, and they're not sharing the vision with the people who are tasked with implementing it. Those blind spots are commonplace across the board, and any one of them can kill your growth. It can kill your business. Have you ever been blindsided?
Definitely. Yeah, where do I even start? I mean, I think certainly with Attend.com, if we think about scar tissue, that was certainly a big one. We came in, wide-eyed, bushy-tailed, thought we could conquer the world, that we were amazing. And, we ultimately got our butts kicked, at the end of it. I certainly wouldn't have seen that coming a year earlier, 2 years earlier, even 6 months earlier. I knew there was conflict, but I don't think I could have seen the escalation point. So certainly.
Interesting. Okay, well, let's talk about conflict then, because one of the other things that I see some of the best organizations doing is they welcome and encourage two things. They welcome failure, because if they punish failure, then it stifles risk-taking. And they welcome constructive conflict. They don't try and avoid it. And net result of that is that you end up getting a much better outcome, because I think it's the grit in the oyster that tends to make the pearl. What are your approaches within Crystal around those two areas of both failure and conflict?
I'm so glad you brought this up. So it's funny. There's a running joke with me where I like to pop bubbles. So you don't want to put me too close to a situation where it's not really working right, but we kind of want to leave it under the rug because I blow it up for better or worse. If you put me into a bad company, I will bring up all the problems to the surface and create a big mess, and then we'll have to deal with them one way or the other. And that's always been, I think, a blessing and a curse. So for us at Crystal, in 2018, Crystal was struggling. We were actually shrinking in revenue. Our product had gotten really bloated, and there were a lot of problems. I think our culture had gotten really lax and sloppy. And so in about mid-2018, did a big analysis and came up with these big 6 problems. And they were ugly. And one of them was, our culture is unorganized. Our product has become bloated. Like these very pokey problems, not just we're close, but it's not there. It's, we are not, this is not working.
They're life-threatening.
Yeah. And not only we presented them to the team, printed them on pages and put them on everybody's desk, hung them on the walls of the office. Everybody knew what those 6 problems were. I'll say some people didn't, looked at it and I think didn't necessarily respond as well. I think the people that were the most effective and frankly have lasted the longest on the team are the ones that kind of rallied around it and said, yes, I see this. These are problems. Let's fix them. So, with conflict, look, similar to, having to let somebody go or reorganize your sales team or cut your highest performers. I don't want to, we talk about these things even on the podcast, like this is what you have to do. But I recognize, and for any listener that's thinking, yeah, Marcus, Greg, this all sounds great, but it's really, really hard. It definitely is. For us, I have always found that you feel so much better once you get the conflict out on the surface. It's like it's bubbling beneath you and you finally get it out. And it was really anxiety producing as you're thinking about it. But once it's out there, it feels so much better and you're getting to a conclusion. So we have certainly at Crystal, we are very conflict oriented. Drew, particularly Drew and I, my business partner, will joke that most of our discussion is just conflict, debating with each other. But as a result, because we bring those different perspectives, we're constantly being challenged. We do it productively where you can't be stubborn. If somebody makes a better point, it's like, okay, that makes sense. Let's run with it. So I think having a culture where you bring the problems up to the surface, actually, I can share our culture value is we drag our flaws into the light with eagerness. When there is a problem, we bring it out into the front. We don't sweep it under the rug and we deal with it Because if we don't, it's going to be much worse later, and we're going to feel so much better once we do. Now, is that always easy? Definitely not. It has caused us to kill product features, do, big projects that are tons of work to fix things that we think are broken. It has generally served us really well, though. And I think organizations where conflict doesn't happen, where people tiptoe around, kind of like debt, you're going to have to pay that back at some point later. You can push it off for now, but eventually that conflict debt gets really difficult to service because it builds up, and then you have a bigger problem that can't fit under the rug, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And again, another fabulous recommendation to read is Patrick Lencioni's Politics, Silos, and Turf Wars. And it's a parable about the importance of doing that, precisely that. Shine a light on your flaws and get
Marcus, you are quite good on the books. Like how I would love to pick your brain. And how do you schedule? Do you actually read all these? How do you find the time to do it? You have them all in your memory.
I was gifted.
You're like a walking library.
I was gifted with dodgy eyesight about 6-7 years ago. I discovered the joy of Audible. So I've listened to, I think probably over the last 7-8 years, 750 books. And it's been really incredibly useful. One of my big bugbears is that I think most salespeople in particular become functionally illiterate as soon as they leave college or university. And there is no excuse. You should be feeding your mind every day. So there's not a day goes by since I was 21 where I haven't done between 1 and 6 hours of study. And it's constant. The more I know, the more questions I have. I don't think you can ever fill your mind up. That's the beauty of it. It just seems an endless stream of fabulous storage. And the variety as well. Read widely, read history, read geology, read geopolitics, read fiction. And by having that breadth, you then end up with the ability to join the dots and connect the seemingly unconnected. So I did have one more question for you before we start wrapping up, which is, what are you challenged by? What are you wrestling with at the moment?
Yeah, so I mean, this one's specific to Crystal, though I'm sure other companies have similar. So our sales have historically been self-service. So, and that's part has helped us to grow, really nicely and profitably. So anybody can go and sign up for Crystal. They can use it for free. And then if they want to buy our premium tools, they can throw in their credit card. And that's gotten us to a really great point over the last few years. We are just now kind of feel like the product is at the right place and our pricing model is at the right place where we can build out an inside sales team. So kind of the bread and butter of what you talk about so much. We, of course, sell to so many salespeople, but our sales have been primarily self-service. So we're now in the process of really getting to eat our own dog food and build out that bigger sales and marketing team. So as you know, that is no easy feat. So my biggest challenge now, and I think for the rest of 2020, is proving out that we can grow our company from a purely self-service model that is pretty mature, predictable. We are now entering this totally new world of building out an inside sales organization. And that is hard. So we have a lot of experimenting to do. We've just hired some great people. I'm really confident that they're going to be great. But as you know, now there's a lot of things I need to do to make sure I enable them to be great. We enable them to be great. So I would say that is certainly going to be my team's biggest challenge, at least over the next 6 to 12 months, is proving out the viability that we can sell our product, up market in an inside sales motion. A path that many have gone before, but challenging nonetheless.
Well, on that note, then, there are a couple of things that are really worth exploring. The first thing is begin with the end in mind. So start thinking about the business that you want to be in 5 years' time and work backwards from there. So what is this VP of sales? What's the reason that you are hiring them for? And what are the milestones along the way? And work backwards from there. Then what I would do is I would look at what are the habits that will make them successful in achieving those objectives. Habits are things that people do repeatedly in the past that they are likely to do repeatedly in the future. So if we look at the habits of a great CRO, for example, they will probably have some type of sales operating model and there'll be a rhythm to it. So they will have things like people development, revenue generation, and field communication. and you're looking for the actions that they need to take and why they need to take them. So one-to-ones with their direct reports, skills development and will identification, QVRs to ensure that there's regular communication, there's improved execution, quarterly reviews with their direct reports and making sure that trickles down through the organization, succession planning, things like that, really important. Yep. Deal reviews, customer contact. Again, one of the things that we see very often is VPs operating from an ivory tower or coming in only to close the big deals. That's not their job. Their job is to, ride along is very important, and there's a process for that. But don't just turn up and then steal all the glory. Your job is to make sure that your guys are performing really well out in the field. Have a good operational review process so that you know what the state of the field is, what the metrics are, what the capacity is, making sure that you've got the right resource balance, all of this kind of stuff. So start with habits, then look at attitudes, beliefs, and values, because those are really good predictors of future performance as well. And I would start with the values first. Make sure their values align with your values as a business. Because if you start hiring people with the wrong kind of values, then, for example, one of my favorite questions when I'm interviewing salespeople very early on is, Greg, when is it okay to lie to a prospect? And I'm looking for the speed at which they say never as much as them saying never. Another question I would like is, I want to know that this is a planner, someone who is organized and has done their planning and preparation.
Could not agree more. It's funny, as you list these things, it's making me feel really great inside, because so many of these were on our checklist, and it's good because it came from now 4 companies of hiring sales leaders. At my last company, I actually played the role of sales leader for a time. So getting exposure to all of this, the more things you check off, the more I think of the gentleman we just hired and how great he's going to be in a whole bunch of these areas. So I couldn't agree more, especially on organization. That is another one. It's underrated. And especially in an early stage of a sales environment, there are so many things to keep straight. It's not just being about a great talker that can come in and wow a client. It's making sure all the I's are dotted and T's are crossed and everything's in the CRM and we actually have an accurate pipeline report. Sounds like table stakes, but as you know, that often does not come automatically.
Only about 20% of the data contained in CRM is of any real use. So that's worse than the toss of a coin. And people are making strategic decisions about the future of their business and investments off the back of what's in that pipeline. If you haven't got the CRM right, you've got a real problem. I know dozens of organizations that have a CRM, and salespeople see it as just an administrative burden instead of the thing that it should be, which is a tool to help them sell more often to more people for more money and remove the administrative burden. That CRM hygiene is really key. But again, a lot of people just let it go by the wayside. And you deserve what you tolerate. That's another really important lesson. What you tolerate, and you get what you measure. So are you measuring the right things? You measuring leading or lagging indicators. That's really critical. Okay. Look, tell me this. You've got a golden ticket, and you could go back and whisper in the idiot Greg's ear, age 23, and you could give him one choice bit of advice. What would you whisper in his ear to prevent a lifetime of misery and self-sabotage?
Well, it's funny because 23-year-old Greg was when Drew and I were getting forced out of our company. So it's good you picked that age, because he could have used some help. I don't know if anything is a lifetime of sabotage. I mean, interestingly, at the time when we talk about scar tissue and we think back to that time, that was a pretty major piece of scar tissue. And of course, at the time, it was emotionally traumatizing. It was miserable. As a founder, to have that happen, you're miserable. Now, looking back, it is probably one of the experiences I am most grateful for. because I learned so much. Our advisors would joke that you earned your MBA in like 3 months by going through this mess.
Yeah.
So I would almost, as I think about what I'd whisper to 23-year-old me, there's obviously lots of tactical things I could have done differently in that company, in that situation, managing our investors. But I almost would think about now whispering to 23-year-old me, stay the course. You're gonna appreciate this later, even though you feel like absolute garbage right now. I promise it will feel better later. Stay the course. That would have been a really tough pill to swallow at age 23, but probably would have been the good advice to give.
Excellent. Well, it's great advice. I mean, failure is rarely ever fatal, and success is rarely ever permanent. I think one of the mistakes that people make is they become bloated and proud when they're successful. And I interviewed Daniel Marcos, who is the partner of Vern Harnish on the Scale Up Institute. And his first business was a rip-roaring success. And then he set up another business and he thought he was invincible. And then the subprime market crashed. And he was selling subprime mortgages to Latinos in the US. And he survived one day. And then he learned that he wasn't invincible. And all the things that he was lucky with the first time round really it was blind luck, dumb luck. It had absolutely nothing to do with his management or entrepreneurial aptitude. And I think we've all had to learn that the hard way, because if you're operating under the illusion that you're invincible, then that's hubris. The gods have a way of bringing you back down to earth.
You need to make a side business of printing some of these quotes on shirts. I think a lot of people would buy it. You got a lot of good wisdom quotes here that could go on the back of a t-shirt.
Well, you never know. That could be a sideline. What are you being influenced by? What are you reading, watching, listening to that you think other people would really benefit from?
I don't know if I have any secrets here. I really like First Round Capital, on the investment firm in San Francisco. They have a really great service, the First Round Review. They're just really good in-depth articles and features. They have one that goes into like the top 50 questions you should ask during an executive interview. Then another similar tactical one, like a great blueprint of how to find if you and your co-founder are the right match for each other. So First Round in general produces a lot of really great stuff. So they're probably one of my good go-tos. I often unsubscribe from a lot of email newsletters. That's one I haven't been able to. I don't always read them, but I'm always excited they're in my inbox and knowing that I could read them. So I'd say that's probably one of my favorites. And then for books, and gosh, I feel inferior talking to you about books given how many you're reading. But the books that I tend to like the most are almost like business history books. And you talked a little bit about history, but like, I don't know what do you even call the genre, but like, the story about Uber, the story about American Airlines, and the story about BlackBerry and how they went up and down. It's like the business history books, Barbarians at the Gate with the takeover of RJR Nabisco, like all those kinds of books that they're fun to read. They're page turners, but there's also so much relevance to your own business, but it's packaged in such a fun way. So I cannot get enough of those. I feel like I've been scrounging, like scraping at the bottom of the barrel on Amazon Kindle store to find other similar stories like that. But those tend to be my favorite. And yeah.
Two I think you will really enjoy then. Principles by Ray Dalio.
Yeah, great one.
If you haven't read that, definitely do. And The Road Less Stupid by Keith Cunningham.
That one I haven't done yet.
Every chapter is riddled with questions that will make you squirm in your chair. And it's hilarious and uncomfortable at every moment. Strong recommend. And if anyone knows Keith Cunningham, please put us in touch because I want to get him on the podcast. It's one of my top 5 business books of all time. Excellent. Okay. So Greg, tell me something. How can people get hold of you?
Best way, find me on LinkedIn, probably the fastest one. If you search Greg Skloot Crystal, I'll pop right up. There's only one set of Skloots, so there's only one version of me, so I'm easy to find. I do some blogging, so if you go to my last name, skloot.org, I've got some good articles there, particularly about sales and marketing that might be relevant. And there's an easy contact form too. So Feel free to shoot me a message on LinkedIn, shoot me a message on the website. I love connecting with other entrepreneurs and chatting and, helping each other. So please feel free to reach out.
Thank you. Are you hiring at the moment?
As of today, we filled the two, as of Friday, we're recording on a Monday, we filled the two major roles we were recruiting for. So we are thinking about a product manager hire later in 2020. So depending on when you're listening to this, that's something we're thinking about. We'll likely be hiring remote. But that's the big one coming up in the next few months. And then, of course, we'll be scaling out our sales team. So that'll probably be in late 2020, early 21. So we've got a lot of work to do in between. But luckily, we just filled our two big roles a couple of days ago, which I'm very excited about.
Congratulations. I wish you
the
very best of luck with that. This is Marcus Kauke signing off from the Scale Ups and Hypergrowth podcast. If you have enjoyed this interview, then please like, comment, and share. And please subscribe. And if there's somebody that you think would make a great guest, then please put them in touch with me at mcauchi@sandler.com. And in the meantime, happy selling and stay safe. Thanks again, Greg.
Thank you for having me. It's a great time.
Pleasure. Bye-bye.